Well, we are going to complete our series on the book of Esther. And as you know, we have this image that you see here is from the Daily Growth email, an earlier version of it. And we do it, as you know, on an annual cycle. So right now, we're halfway through the scriptures again. And every time we do it, you're going to see different things each time. But one of the themes, the things this came from, though, was from the source of most of this content was from my talk through the Bible. And a few of you have a copy of that, but the talk through the Bible. So this would be, for example, the portion on Esther in Talk Through the Bible, where I have a opening paragraph about that summarizes the book. And then there's a chart that we have, and then followed by, always do the same thing, introduction and title, followed by the author, a word about that, the date and the setting, and then that's followed by the keys to the book, keyword, verses, chapter, Christ. How is Christ seen in each book of the Bible? I actually did a thing, Jesus in the Bible, a little booklet that's now out of print for Thomas Nelson, but how is he seen in every book of the Bible? And then, what's the unique contribution that this book makes to Esther? And then there's a survey, and this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to walk you through my survey as a way of going through this, because I wanted to synthesize and summarize, because it is a story. It's a great story. It's a great drama. And so we want to make sure we understand it as such and see now all the bits in the story, merging together. So we're doing all the chapters, but we skipped chapter 10 because it wasn't as essential to the story that we had. But I'm going to kind of walk you through this, and so rather than reading it from here, the thing that this adds is a prayer as well, and then a meditation passage that we could chew on there. So let's go then from here, and I'm going to walk you through this great story of Esther, and give you a feel for the brilliance and the themes, the ironies, the twists and plot turns, the unexpected surprises, the providential care of God that are characteristic of all this material. It's astonishing, really, as a piece of literature, just as a piece of drama, a historical, a dramatic piece, a story, a yarn. It's really tough to beat. As you know, it's filled with these Hitchcockian kinds of plot twists. Alfred Hitchcock would be, I wish he had done this, but put it in a different setting, disguise it enough and put it in another place, another time, but it's the same story. And I think he would have done a wonderful thing with the surprises and the twists and the moments of horror. And I've taken about Haman, for example, the moment when he's thinking, man, am I going up on the king's site? And he's invited me to a second banquet here, and the queen has invited me. Then he realizes that's his death banquet, but the horror, the realization is that everything turns, and what a difference the day can make, and how the mighty are brought down, but how the humble are elevated up. So you can, with a rich story, with metaphors and images and narratives of this nature, you can pull a lot of stuff out of it. It's that thick and rich. So as a piece of dramatic literature, then, it's tough to beat. It really is. And I think one would do very well to take biblical stories like this, but not make them so obvious. Don't redo Esther, but do Esther in a different setting and disguise it enough to where you get the best bits of it. I think that would make sense, wouldn't it? And be an interesting thing. And I think that's would be a great source of wonderful plots that have been not really fully explored in our time. So let me just kind of walk you through this and make some comments about this as we move. So the survey, the clearly emerging message, though, and this is a thing I want you to notice, that God uses ordinary men and women to overcome impossible circumstances to accomplish his gracious purposes. There's a lot in that statement. And he uses the likes of all of us. There are no special people that are so high and exalted above others that they don't matter. Everyone matters. Everything matters. Every situation matters. And so seeing that your day then is brought into the spiritual because it's the splendor of the ordinary that is being enriched. The splendor of the ordinary is where every day matters. And there's no thing that's so mundane, so routine, so base that cannot be brought into the presence of God with what George Herbert calls this tincture, with this elixir, which is as the Lord wills, you see. So teach me, my God and King, in all things thee to see, and what I do in anything to do it as through thee. And that's the whole idea. Not rudely as a beast to go into an action, but still to make thee prepossess and give it his perfection. A man who looks on glass, on it may stay his eye. You can look at the window and see the cobwebs and so forth, or you can do what? You can look through the glass, through the window, and then the heavens espy. You get to choose. Are you looking at the surface of life, or are you looking through it? And you see the spiritual behind you, you see. So this idea, all may of thee partake. Nothing can be so mean that with this tincture, for thy sake, will not grow bright and clean. So the for thy sake turns the routine into riches, the ordinary into the extraordinary, the apparently secular into the spiritual. And that is really you and I in this world being called to fidelity in the give and take and rough and tumble of the goods and ills of a fallen world, in which we appear to be in a tragedy now. And yet we know, as we cultivate an eternal perspective, that we're not in a tragedy. There's another act to come. And when the next act comes, it'll reveal that this tragedy will have become, in fact, a comedy, because it's going to end well. This is why I say, do you really believe that the least of heaven is better than the best of earth? Do you, in fact, believe that? Take the best moments, experiences you've ever known on earth, and how do they compare with heaven? They won't even, they're only hints of a better good you cannot yet name, but you will not be disappointed when you see it that way. If I truly believe that, why don't I train myself to long for heaven and use earth more fully than I now do? So that's what this book's about in that sense. And as I see it, this literature is designed to help us to see how the apparently routine or ordinary or overlooked can be extraordinary. So let me go through it then. The chapters 1 to 4 is the threat to the Jews. And so we have this little section here in this outline, the threat to the Jews, chapters 1 to 4, and then the triumph of the Jews in chapters 5 to 10. So that's the basic structure of the outline here. Going back to that. The story begins in Ahasuerus' winter palace at Susa. Now, I should say a word about Ahasuerus, and we mentioned him a little bit earlier in this. Ahasuerus is the Hebrew name of, and Xerxes is the Greek name of Cyrus, king of Persia, in 486 to 464. That was his actual name. And so according to chapter 1, verse 3, the feast of Xerxes took place in his third year. We know that was in 483 BC. And the historian Herodotus refers to this very specific banquet as, so it's this event in Esther is mentioned by Herodotus. And the more we learn about Scripture, the more we realize it's embedded in space-time history. It's not just something made up, but it always fits. And you can know your dates and your times and everything. And it was in the real historical nexus of life, not far ago and long ago, far away and long ago, but rather it's a real place. And so myth and history meet their connection in the gospel. At any rate, the Feast of Xerxes took place in 483. The historian Herodotus refers to this banquet as the occasion of Xerxes' planning for a military campaign against Greece. And so, we know that in 479, a few years later, he was defeated by the Greeks as Salamis. And Herodotus tells us that he sought consolation in his harem. And so the story continues then, because you see, this corresponds to the time when he held a contest and crowned Esther Queen of Persia. That was in 216 to 17. And it tells us it was in his 7th year. So the events of the rest of the book take place in 473. The chronological span is 10 years, 483 to 473. And we can know about the time, because the end of Xerxes' reign was in 464. We know all of this, but we can lock it in, and we even know there's no Greek influence as well, so that since the Greeks overcame the Persians, you would have expected that it was written later. But actually, the palace in Susa that we're reading about was destroyed by fire during this very period. And such an event would probably have been would have been mentioned. And so, again, the historical linguistics don't support a date later than 400 BC. I mentioned here that Xerxes was a boisterous man of emotional extremes, whose actions were often strange and contradictory. We know this from Herodotus' account, but we know this from this text as well. This sheds light on his ability to sign a decree for the annihilation of the Jews, and then 2 months later to sign a second decree allowing them to overthrow their enemies, you see. And so, and again though, God's purposes are achieved through this quality of this man. And so it's intriguing how all things work together in ways you could never have guessed. Esther was addressed to many Jews who didn't return to their homeland, because not all the godly people left. Some did not return for legitimate reasons, and most were disobedient and staying in Persia. Nevertheless, God continued to care for his people who were in voluntary exile. So I continue to go back to my story here. And going back to it then, it was in his winter palace in Susa. Lavish banquet, display of royal glory for the people of Susa. And he proudly seeks to make Queen Vashti's beauty a part of the program. This was not on her plan. It was not on her agenda. She didn't want to be thrown around or shown as a showpiece. And so she felt that being the queen, I don't need to be summoned in this way. This led to a bit of a problem here in the end. It didn't turn out in her best interest. Because when she refused to appear, the king is given counsel by his advisors to depose her and seek another woman, because it's feared that the other women will get ideas. They'll become insolent. If Vashti goes unpunished, what's going to happen? All the guys in this kingdom are going to be in serious trouble, you see. So if we let her get away with this, it'll be bad for all of us at home. So you want to be the ruler of the nest, the ruler of the keep, then you better take care of this. Needs to be done. It is interesting, though. You realize, though this is thousands of years ago, you're dealing with something that is actually so relevant, because human nature doesn't change a bit. They were bearers of the image of God in the same way you are. Now, that image has been tarnished and been distorted, but it still exists. It's when we come into Christ, though, then that image is made what it was intended to be, partially in this life, fully in the next. But you bear things in you that you cannot deny. And this fundamental need for beauty and for goodness and for truth are certain fundamentals that we all seek, for authenticity, for meaning, for identity, and for purpose. And we're going to try to find it in all the same kinds of ways. It's just variations on certain motifs, but the stories are always important. And the stories we tell reveal our own life journeys as well. One of my covenant friends has written his life story, and I'm in the process of reading through it, discovering lots of things about him, and kind of almost like living his life through him. It's a strange thing, and when you think about that. And so your empathy for another person is to actually connect with their story and connect your story and your journey with that person's journey. And God's the divine master of ceremonies who puts people together, because you can't control that. It's amazing, though, that some person connects you with this other person. Then you both discover you have a common love of, oh, you like that too? And immediately you're interested in that. You have a friendship, and things of that occur. Continuing, though, she refuses to appear. Kings depose, the council to depose her and to seek another queen. So Esther later finds favor in the sight of Ahasuerus and wins the royal beauty pageant. At her uncle Mordecai's instruction, she doesn't reveal that she's Jewish. And there's a lot of wisdom behind that. There's a kind of a sub-theme that goes throughout this narrative. And though God's name is not mentioned in it, it's his evident purposes and providential care is there. So with her help, Mordecai is able to warn the king of an assassination plot. And his deed is recorded in the palace records. Meanwhile, Haman becomes captain, so it's important for us to know about the warning of the king, because that becomes yet another plot development, because that warning then is later going to be a part of the story. Each thing connects together. His deeds recorded in the palace records, and that's the end of it, it would appear. Meanwhile, Haman becomes captain of the princes, and Mordecai refuses to bow to him, and so it becomes more and more about this man, who becomes a hater of the Jews because of his sense of dignity has been insulted by this Jewish man who refuses to bow before him and show him the deference that he requires and deserves. You know how people are. They just expect those kinds of things, and their own self-inflated importance produces a real mockery and a destructive nature in everybody who succumbs to that. But to humble yourself, it's the whole process, isn't it, of the egocentricity, either moving toward where Christ becomes enthroned, and you more and less become less enthroned. You dethrone yourself, you get back on. You dethrone yourself, you get back on. But hopefully, after a while, you begin to do this enough. You train yourself to where you're more spring-loaded to be Christocentric than egocentric. But that's a training, isn't it? It's a process. It's gradual. So it happens with Mordecai. So it happens with Esther. When he learns that Mordecai is Jewish, though, Haman plots for a year to eliminate all the Jews. As his rage and hatred grow, he casts lots, and that's where the term Purim, which becomes a feast celebrating the Jews' victory over this nefarious plot, is a theme. So he casts them on a daily basis. I don't know what vehicle he was using for his divination, but divination was a very popular, very widely practiced thing. Even when Joseph, remember, do you not know that someone like me can practice divination when his cup is apparently stolen? So what is this divination? People were much more connected with that than we are now, and actually makes perfect sense, because you get into spiritualism and all kinds of other nonsense. It was all the rage during Arthur Conan Doyle's day, and so he was all into that. That idea of these seances and so forth. A lot of people were sucked into that for a period of time. Now we're getting sucked into even worse and more nefarious kinds of forms of divination. But that's another discussion about our culture. The best way to have him massacred. So apparently he's got some vehicle that's going to determine, when he throws the dice, that that's going to connect it to a particular day that's optimal for the destruction of the Jews. What forces he's trying to evoke. Of course, what people do is in order to get some measure of apparent power, they will submit something for a price to be paid. Now, there is power in some of this stuff. It's not to be completely just denied. There are things in it, because they're demonic agencies that can sometimes forge actualities. So you don't want to completely eliminate that, because I think there are demonic kinds of connections and communications. Those are limited, though, in very profound ways. My own wife, though, had such a connection, as some of you know, when she used to read the tarot cards when I was the first at Dallas Seminary, and she became more and more involved in astrology and tarot and occultism. And so our spiritual warfare got very violent in many ways, and it got very intense. I knew she was going to leave me. She was on the verge of leaving me because of all that. But she had a power when she would do, and then I later realized I made two and two connected together, because she could do stuff with those cards that I couldn't account for. And she even had a student who was learning how to do it from her. And it's a long story, but the net of this one, though, is that I recognized in the middle of the night, I started to wake up, and I knew there was an evil presence in the room. It was palpable. I could look up and see something even moving around. And I'd look over and her eyes are looking at it. And it was like 2, 3 in the morning this would happen. And this happened again. And then it again. And then I began to put 2 and 2 together. It happened always on the nights when she read the cards. On those nights, she had a familiar spirit. A familiar spirit is a demonic presence. And it was giving her information about things that you could not normally gain. And I saw that there was a power to that. So that was a spiritual warfare. The story continues. I won't tell you where it all ended, but it ended well because we're married. She didn't leave me. But anyway, there's a lot of power in these things. And so he was involved in that until he determined the best day to have him massacred. And then through bribery and lies, he convinces Ahasuerus to issue an edict that all the Jews in the empire will be slain 11 months hence in a single day. That's what the day. So it would turn out to be a festival, a feast day for the Jews, which now became a day of sorrow. So Haman conceives this plot and envy, and vengeful spirit executes it with malicious craft. And there was the man was demonized. This is not ordinary evil. And as you know, there are different degrees of malevolence and influence, and there can be demonization can be influence, or it can be harassment, a second level. The third level is control. You let a thing have a beach hold, and then it gets a stronghold, and then it has a stranglehold. So there are different degrees of demonization. And I have seen all 3 of those in my own ministry and work and so forth. And this is not stuff that normally is talked about by believers, but the whole Bible talks about spiritual warfare. And if you haven't got it, read go ahead and get conformed to his image and read the facet 11, which talks about spiritual warfare, because you can't understand this book without understanding the dynamics of spiritual warfare. It's very, very embedded in it, very thickly embedded. And there's much more than you know. Of course, as we know, there's the internal warfare with the flesh. Then there are 2 external sources of war, the world and its system, which is determined to leave God out of the equation. And science is succumbed to that with the illusion that mutations and natural selection are going to solve the problem of mystery, of wonders that only get more and more complex, and their thin soup doesn't work. But you have this world, the flesh, and then the world, which provides opportunities for the flesh, and then the devil, which amplifies the flesh. So you're in a warfare, whether you like it or not. If you don't recognize it and use the weapons of the warfare, you are very vulnerable, are you not? You're trying to basically, like I've had in various dreams here, I'm fighting him, but I've got a wooden sword and I'm naked. It's not a pretty picture, you see. So it creates a state of confusion, this decree. You can imagine the confusion that it would produce among the Jews when they heard to their horror that a royal edict had been submitted and populated throughout the entire 170 satraps or provinces of the Persian Empire. It was a vast empire, extensive indeed. And they had couriers that were sent on horses to convey this message throughout the empire. Can you imagine the horror of the Jews realizing that on this particular day, we're all going to get killed? It's like knowing the day of your death. Oh, that's coming up pretty soon. Imagine knowing that, for example, on July 22nd, this month, at 5 a.m., you're going to break your leg. Let's make it 5 p.m. Let's make it 5 p.m. You're going to break your leg. So you decide, well, yeah, that'd be an unpleasant thing to know about, wouldn't it? To know this is going to happen. And as it gets closer and closer, what would you do on 5 p.m. on that day, you'd probably hang around the house and try to not break your leg. Then a tree falls through the roof and breaks your leg. You can't get around it. That's a depressing thought. But it would be like knowing your death date. We all know we have one, and we live in the denial of death, but the reality is we would be smart and prudent to act as if this is our last day. That's the only wise way to live, because you can't presume in the future. But we all have a deadline, literally. But we don't live as if we have one. But this is why with the horror, the collective horror. So she asks Esther, Mordecai asks Esther to appeal to the king and spare the Jews. But it's at the peril of her life, because you see, she has to reveal to the king her nationality in a desperate attempt to dissuade Ahasuerus. Furthermore, she hasn't been called before him these 30 days, and if he doesn't raise the golden scepter, I'll be killed. Because nobody uninvited goes uninvited into the throne room. How's it doing, king? If he doesn't raise the golden scepter, say, you can come. They would immediately come behind him and put something over his head and escort him and have him executed. That's how it was. That's the kind of power you had. It's kind of scary stuff. You don't play with the monarch in that way. It was the Oriental potentate became a metaphor of great fear, and it was. So she's risking her life to do so, but Mordecai is giving her the right counsel. And then we go to the triumph of the Jews, and so let me just go to show you the chart here again. So when we go, now we've talked then about the selection of Esther as queen, and then the formulation of the plot by Haman. I'm sort of just summarizing the plot, just putting the threads together for you briefly. And it's fun to see the whole. That's why I wanted to show you the whole narrative as a unified story. Now we go to the second half, the triumph of the Jews, because this is not a tragedy. It appears to be a tragedy. So this is sort of a sense in which it's like us. This is our life on the earth, and then this is life in heaven. It's almost like, again, the earthly process, but the heavenly outcome. And what appears to be a tragedy, they're moaning and lamenting, ends up as a festival of praise and light and joy and celebration, the Feast of Purim. And so it's the Feast of Ahasuerus contrasted by the Feast of Esther in Purim. And so you have a grave danger and a great deliverance that takes place. And so it's the basic movements. It's one of those books pretty easy to outline. So, and this all takes place in Persia in those 10 years. So we have that kind of scene. And then let me just continue the plot with you. Again, now we go to the triumph. So after fasting, and it was a period of fasting, and she asked those who were with her to fast and prayer, Esther appears before the king and wisely invites him to a banquet along with Haman. See, what request do you have when he raises the golden scepter? Even up to half my kingdoms, it'll be granted to you. Remember he says that to her? And so she's been granted a great favor with the king. And indeed, this is where that great statement, who knows whether you have not attained power, become a queen for such a time as this, if you have not attained royalty. Who knows? Because if you do not interpose, if you do not get involved, relief and help will come for the Jews from another place. And who knows whether you have not attained to royalty for such a time as this. That's why I sometimes use that phrase, such a time as this, as a greeting or as a salutation. The idea of for such a time as this, that's the time we live in. And that's what it's about. Such a time as this is this day. And you do not know your purpose and calling this day. It'll be different than you thought. But if you live in the fullness of this day and treasure the precious present, I think you'll be living with wisdom. And every day matters again. Every day it's not this is a more important day. Yes, you plan on certain things, and I'm excited to announce, for example, that the Beauty and the Sciences event that we're putting together at the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C. has been sold out, and I can't believe it. So we actually oversell it because there won't be show up. So we've actually oversold it. Now we have to put it on a waiting list now. This is a good problem to have, and I'm excited about that. And we got more speakers than we planned. In fact, too many, but we made it a longer event. But it actually worked out. I can't believe how well. But then, as Michael puts it, we not only got a sold-out show, but we have a new, what do you call it? Well, we sold one out. We added a show. So on Sunday morning, there's a new show. They have, because I realized we couldn't do it before, but if we changed the time on Sunday morning, I was going to do a special thing. Instead of 9 to 11, make it 10 to 12. That'll still work because the museum doesn't open till 10. That changed the rules and made it possible for anyone to come to this event if they sign up, on Saturday, the Sunday morning event. I'm going to be doing a thing then on the pointers in the microcosm and macrocosm. And I want to dazzle them with the glory of God. After all, it's on beauty and sciences. And then the other thing I want to do is have a worship experience of something I've never seen done or done before. And Michael and I are working together on a good experience for this. And it's going to be a 3-part thing. Part 1 is going to be the microcosm. I'm going to be using beauty, using clips and images, and combining that with appropriate music, powerful contemplative music, and occasional scripture, and make that about a 10-minute or so devotional experience of worship. Then the next section will be using the midicosm, the biosphere. And then the last section, again, different music and different images. Now the last one will be images of the macrocosm. It'll end up with the clusters of galaxies, the Hubble Deep Field and the Webb Deep Field and things like that, the glory of God. And again, with different music and so forth. So it's going to be rather fun to do. So I say that because I'm excited about it. And yet, I need to live this day as if it was as important as that day. You see where I'm going with that? I'm excited about it, and God, He does do special things on special days. Of course, we know that. But each day should be regarded, though, as a holy opportunity you're not going to get again. And each day is all you've got. So you don't want to live in the future. You want to live in the fullness of the present tense, because that's the thing that's closest to eternity is the present, not the future. And when we see that, then, because you don't have your future and your past is gone. But let's continue on our journey. Back to the image here. So at the banquet, she requests that they attend a second banquet, which is an interesting thing because even there she says, all right, what's your request? Hey, let me come on to another banquet. She kind of does it in stepwise progression. There's a wisdom in this, and it sets up Haman as well in various ways. But she wants the right moment to divulge her request. And so once again he says, the second time, anything you want, up to half my kingdom. So Haman, of course, is so flattered, but he's then enraged when he sees Mordecai, and his self-adulation is not shared by this Jew. And so because of that, he allows this man to ruin his joy and his pleasure. So he takes months for Mordecai. He takes his wife's suggestion to build a large gallows for Mordecai, because he was a real social bore. He gathers all his friends to talk about his wealth and about how many sons he has. And about that. You don't want to be around a guy who's like that. Let me talk about me. Okay, I've talked enough about me. Now you talk about me. Have you known people like that? That's what I call a real bore. You see, totally uninterested in the others. And they're just basically scavengers and hangers-on because obviously they see some benefit, financial benefit, because he had wealth and so forth. And you know how that is. Are these really friends? And one can't be sure in that situation. So, but he can't wait for the 11 months for Mordecai to be slain. So so she advises him to build a gallows, and it's 50 cubits, 75 feet high. This is a big gallows. And it would have required it being constructed all night long. And maybe that's what kept Ahasuerus awake at night, because they were building this gallows. Ahasuerus couldn't sleep. So he treats his insomnia by reading the palace records. I can't think of a better soporific than palace records to put me back to sleep again. But God sovereignly uses that time And at that moment, and of all the records that could have been read at that particular time, it's the story about how it was Mordecai who actually led to his deliverance from an assassination plot. Hey, has he ever been rewarded for this? No, I looked that up, and no. Well, then we need to see, is there anyone in the courtyard? Is there anyone in the court? And of course, at this point, it was Haman who was there, came early. He was the first guy in the court because he was so eager to have Mordecai killed and hung on his gallows. So he calls him in. And as the story continues here, reading about Mordecai's deeds, he wants him to be honored. So Haman, mistakenly thinking the king wants to honor him, as an egoist would. Oh, it must be about me, you see. Who would the king want to honor more than me? This guy didn't have an ego problem. He had an ego of colossal ego that was, it just consumed the planet. It was like me, mine, me. Tell the king that he wants to, how they should, so, this is what I'd want. And it was, by the way, the honor way he would have is to become like the king, to have his palace, to have his robe and all that. In other words, he reveals his own ambition. If he could, he'd usurp the king, as such as his arrogance. No, but then you find out the reward is for Mordecai. Now, do exactly what I told you to do, but do it for Mordecai. And then he's right in there ready to invite the king to have him hung on his gallows. All of a sudden, everything changes. Can you imagine the humility with which he then had to do this and how he was moaning? He was humbled and infuriated by being forced to honor the man he loathes. Another plot, an image of an irony. And again, sovereign purposes working together and construing a pattern and a plan. That the second banquet, he offers again, the third time he says, what's your request this time? Even up to half my kingdom. And so she then makes her plea for her people and says, if it was just because of my life or my family, but this affects my whole all my people. And so she accuses Haman of this treachery. And the infuriated king, and then the king goes out, and at that moment, Haman makes the blunder of falling upon her, appealing to her mercy. And then the king happens to walk in just when he's on top of her. It looks like he's groping her, you see. And he's actually making. Will the king even do this in my own palace, in my own place? And then they call for them and to have him brought out, and he's going to be hung. But then his advisor says, "Why don't you hang him on Mordecai's? He's just built this thing here. Hang him on that." So being hoisted on your own petard. Actually, it comes to pass in this case because he's hung on that gallows that he had built up overnight. So again, the gallows 75, designed to make Mordecai's downfall a citywide spectacle. It ironically provides Haman with unexpected public attention. He got his public attention all right, posthumously. Persian law has sealed with the king's ring, and it cannot be revoked. But the solution would be to a new decree, and it was a big request that she made for him to do that, because the laws of the Medes and the Persians cannot be violated. But the creative solution, and this is where righteousness is creative, and sin is boringly repetitive. Here's the creative alternative of issuing a second decree that would give the Jews the right to defend themselves. When this because they can't stop the other, but it prepares the Jews to assemble and defend themselves, and they have the right to do so. And when the day that happens, then it changes the outcome intended by the first order and produces great joy and celebration among the people in advance of this, because now they look at that day not as a day of dread, but a day that'll be, by God's grace, a day of victory. So the fateful day of the two decrees arrives, and the Jews defeat their enemies on that day of Purim, on that feast day, throughout their cities, throughout the entire Persian provinces. But they do not take the plunder, but rather they don't want to be regarded as having profited at the hands of their enemy. So they choose not to take the plunder. That's most significant. In fact, it was based upon the plunder that would be acquired that Haman made the plot and said, "We'll give you this much money." Of course, we're going to take it out of that plunder. So it's intriguing how that was a huge thing they did. So the next day, a feast of celebration, an annual Jewish holiday called the Feast of Purim. And again, it's derived from this word, the Assyrian puru, which means lot, referring to the lots cast by Haman to determine the day decreed for Jewish annihilation. And then the narrative closes with the advancement of Mordecai to a position second only to the king. So he acquires all of Haman's household, his enemy, and all the dignity that he could have as the most, basically under the king. He's the most powerful person in that empire. It's amazing, the switches from one thing to another. And I invite you to see in those switches your own life, because you see, you have a story, and in your story, we're moving from one side of the thing to another. Or sometimes I will put it, I talk about these acts and the 4 acts. And the 4 acts are creation, fall, redemption, and the new creation. And one way of seeing it is this. So this whole idea of creation, fall, redemption, restoration. And we are on the cusp between redemption and restoration. I think we're right about here. I think we're in the 11th hour. I think we're just about to go across. And so when that happens, suddenly at this juncture, everything becomes new. And then the story really begins. The story which no one has ever yet read on this earth. The great story in which, as C.S. Lewis puts it, in which every chapter becomes better than the one before. It's a story yet to be told. And so that story of restoration is the story of a new creation in which all will be made well. Isn't that a lovely story? And that's your story. If you really see it in this way, you can see it as well as something that is an invitation for you to realize, so you too live in a time of threat, but you're going to live in a time of triumph. And God has granted us a good deal more than most people on this planet has ever even dreamed of or imagined. You live better than kings. And the reality is you have more comfort, more options, more luxury than an Ahasuerus could even have dreamed about, or even a Napoleon, or whoever you want to think about until the most recent years. You have power and privilege and prestige and opportunity in terms of all the access that you have, so many resources that, in fact, we're overloaded with them and overwhelmed by them. But at the same time, you realize that you have to embed your story, because the more we have wealth and the more we have of this world's good, the more it'll tether us to this world. And you'll be held down by it. And that's a very profound danger for all of us to recognize, that we can be tethered by this world, and instead of becoming the people we're intended to be, the worries of the world and put this up here. The ones on whom seed was sown, because God's intention for us is to move out of this first quadrant and the hoping in the now and hoping in the seen, to go from there to another quadrant, a better quadrant, quadrant 3, where you train yourself in this world to be living with the next world in mind, and where you begin to hope in the unseen, not just the seen, and you begin rather to see the unseen and live in that. And some people have different courses in which they have a trajectory. It's those few who make it across there. But many people, though, the worries of the world, the deceitfulness of riches, and the desire for other things choke the word and make it unfruitful. And so it prevents them from moving beyond the children to the higher level, which is childlikeness. So the childlikeness is beyond children. Now you are a child of the King. And the more childlike you are, the more you realize that the best is yet to come. And all the stories, the best of the goods of beauty and intimacy and adventure, are only hints of better goods to come. So you begin to cultivate a longing for God's purposes in your life, so that you begin to see that you're meant for more. So a childlikeness, I've come to define in one way as the inability of being bored, because if you really grasp what's going on, you're surrounded by and immersed by mystery. I was studying when I was at Habersham and on Roswell. Just before that, there was these beautiful hyacinths that are there, and they're just the splendor, and nobody notices it, but just the way they are elegant, not just the blossoms themselves, but the place on the bush, and it's just to look at that elegance, and most people never even notice the beauty in which and the mystery in which they are emerged. It's an astonishing thing. You have to cultivate this a seeing eye and a hearing ear. And in doing so, you also have to cultivate an aspiration for a better home than you currently have. And so the realization that the best of this earth, again, is only a hint of better goods to come. And that is a way of living then, in which I think it makes perfect sense for us to do that. So my desire is to go to the other side and to actually eventually move into that realm of reality, in which, you've seen this before, if I'd only known, and that those eyes of this boy who hears for the first time is look of fear and wonder at the same time. And I believe that's what we're going to be like when we see him, if I'd only known. So let's take it out. So that takes us to my overview of the book of Esther. That it's like a subset of a microcosm of life, and you are in that journey yourself. And so, I have a few minutes. Do I? Maybe not.
One question.
One question. Okay. All right. Question from back there. Yeah. Yes. She knew that. Exactly right. And Mordecai was saying, don't suppose that by trying to save your life, you're going to save it, because in the long run, you're going to perish with the rest. But if I perish, I perish. There was no condition on that. Just as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, when they said, we're not going to go in there, and even if our God doesn't deliver us, we're still not going to do it. Because there's a possibility that they would be destroyed. They had no guarantee, no assurance. But if I perish, I perish. So it's going to be a life and death deal at the end of the day, where you have to decide what is your life worth. And so who determines the value of life? So having a holy aspiration and a willingness to lose your life to find his life.